John Dewey was an American philosopher, psychologist, Georgist, and educational reformer whose ideas have been influential in education and social reform. Dewey is one of the primary figures associated with the philosophy of pragmatism and is considered one of the founders of functional psychology. A review of General Psychology survey, published in 2002, ranked Dewey as the 93rd most cited psychologist of the 20th century. A well-known public intellectual, he was also a major voice of progressive education and liberalism. Although Dewey is known best for his publications about education, he also wrote about many other topics, including epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, art, logic, social theory, and ethics. The overriding theme of Dewey's works was his profound belief in democracy, be it in politics, education or communication and journalism. As Dewey himself stated in 1888, while still at the University of Michigan, democracy and the one ultimate ethical ideal of humanity are to my mind synonymous. Known for his advocacy of democracy, Dewey considered two fundamental elements, schools and civil society, to be major topics needing attention and reconstruction to encourage experimental intelligence and plurality. Dewey asserted that complete democracy was to be obtained not just by extending voting rights but also by ensuring that there exists a fully formed public opinion, accomplished by communication among citizens, experts, and politicians, with the latter being accountable for the policies they adopt. Life and works. Dewey was born in Burlington, Vermont, to a family of modest means. Dewey was one of four boys born to Archibald Sprague Dewey and Lucina Artemisia Rich Dewey. The second-born son and first John born to Archibald and Lucina died in a tragic accident on January 17, 1859. On October 20, 1859, John Dewey was born, 40 weeks after the death of his older brother. Like his older brother, Davis Rich Dewey, he attended the University of Vermont, where he was initiated into Delta Psi, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1879. A significant professor of Dewey's at the University of Vermont was Henry A. P. Torrey, the son-in-law and nephew of former University of Vermont President Joseph Torrey. Dewey studied privately with Torrey between his graduation from Vermont and his enrollment at Johns Hopkins University. After 2 years as a high school teacher in Oil City, Pennsylvania and one teaching elementary school in the small town of Charlotte, Vermont, Dewey decided that he was unsuited for employment in primary or secondary education. After studying with George Sylvester Morris, Charles Sanders Peirce, Herbert Baxter Adams, and G. Stanley Hall, Dewey received his Ph.D. from the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. In 1884, he accepted a faculty position at the University of Michigan with the help of George Sylvester Morris. His unpublished and now lost dissertation was titled The Psychology of Kant. In 1894, Dewey joined the newly founded University of Chicago, where he developed his belief in rational empiricism, becoming associated with the newly emerging pragmatic philosophy. His time at the University of Chicago resulted in 4 essays collectively entitled Thought and Its Subject Matter, which was published with collected works from his colleagues at Chicago under the collective title Studies in Logical Theory. During that time, Dewey also initiated the University of Chicago laboratory schools, where he was able to actualize the pedagogical beliefs that provided material for his first major work on education, the school and society. Disagreements with the administration ultimately caused his resignation from the university, and soon thereafter he relocated near the East Coast. In 1899, Dewey was elected president of the American Psychological Association. From 1904 until his retirement in 1930, he was professor of philosophy at both Columbia University and Columbia University's Teachers College. In 1905, he became president of the American Philosophical Association. He was a longtime member of the American Federation of Teachers. along with the historians Charles A. Beardham, James Harvey Robinson, and the economist Thorstein Veblen. Dewey is one of the founders of the New School. Dewey's most significant writings were The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, a critique of a standard psychological concept and the basis of all his further work, Democracy and Education. His celebrated work on progressive education, Human Nature and Conduct, a study of the function of habit in human behavior, the public and its problems, a defense of democracy written in response to Walter Lippmann's The Phantom Public, Experience and Nature. Dewey's most metaphysical statement, Art as Experience. Dewey's major work on aesthetics, A Common Faith, a humanistic study of religion, originally delivered as the Dwight H. Terry Lectureship at Yale. Logic, The Theory of Inquiry, a statement of Dewey's unusual conception of logic, freedom and culture, a political work examining the roots of fascism, and Knowing and the Known, a book written in conjunction with Arthur F. Bentley that systematically outlines the concept of transaction, which is central to his other works. While each of these works focuses on one particular philosophical theme, Dewey included his major themes in most of what he published. He published more than 700 articles in 140 journals, and approximately 40 books, reflecting his immense influence on 20th-century thought. Hilda Neatby, in 1953, wrote, Dewey has been to our age what Aristotle was to the later Middle Ages, not a philosopher, but the philosopher. Dewey was first married to Alice Chipman. They had 6 children. His second wife was Roberta Lowitz Grant. The United States Postal Service honored Dewey with a prominent American Series 30 postage stamp. Visits to China and Japan. In 1919, while traveling in Japan on sabbatical leave, Dewey was invited by Peking University to visit China, probably at the behest of his former students, Hu and Chiang Monline. Dewey and his wife, Alice, arrived in Shanghai on May 1, 1919, just days before student demonstrators took to the streets of Peking to protest the decision of the Allies in Paris to cede the German-held territories in Shandong province to Japan. Their demonstrations on May 4 excited and energized Dewey, and he ended up staying in China for 2 years, leaving in July 1921. In these 2 years, Dewey gave nearly 200 lectures to Chinese audiences and wrote nearly monthly articles for Americans in the New Republic and other magazines. Well aware of both Japanese expansionism into China and the attraction of Bolshevism to some Chinese, Dewey advocated that Americans support China's transformation and that Chinese base this transformation in education and social reforms, not revolution. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people attended the lectures, which were interpreted by Hu. For these audiences, Dewey represented Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science, the two personifications which they thought of representing modern values, and hailed him as second Confucius. Perhaps Dewey's biggest impact, however, was on the forces for progressive education in China, such as Hu and Chiang Monline, who had studied with him, and Tao Xingji, who had studied at Columbia School of Education. Their letters from China and Japan describing their experiences to their family were published in 1920, edited by their daughter Evelyn. During and after his visit, his commentaries on China would be published in such periodicals as the New Republic, Asia, the China Review, and sometimes in newspapers like the Baltimore Sun. Though discussing Chinese philosophy, but rarely. One article in 1922, As the Chinese Think, discusses the teachings of Laozi and Confucius in an attempt to improve understanding of the Chinese in international business relations. Visit to Southern Africa. Dewey and his daughter Jane went to South Africa in July 1934, at the invitation of the World Conference of New Education Fellowship in Cape Town and Johannesburg, where he delivered several talks. The conference was opened by the South African Minister of Education Jan Hofmeyr, and Deputy Prime Minister Jan Smuts. Other speakers at the conference included Max Eiselen and Hendrik Verwoerd, who would later become Prime Minister of the nationalist government. John and Jane's expenses were paid by the Carnegie Foundation. He also traveled to Durban, Pretoria and Victoria Falls in what was then Rhodesia and looked at schools, talked to pupils, and gave lectures to the administrators and teachers. In August 1934, Dewey accepted an honorary degree from the University of the Witwatersrand, functional psychology. At the University of Michigan, Dewey published his first two books, Psychology, and Leibniz's New Essays Concerning the Human Understanding, both of which expressed Dewey's early commitment to British neo-Hegelianism. In psychology, Dewey attempted a synthesis between idealism and experimental science. While still professor of philosophy at Michigan, Dewey and his junior colleagues, James Hayden Tufts and George Herbert Mead, together with his student James Roland Angell, all influenced strongly by the recent publication of William James' Principles of Psychology, began to reformulate psychology, emphasizing the social environment on the activity of mind and behavior rather than the physiological psychology of Wundt and his followers. By 1894, Dewey had joined Tufts, with whom he would later write Ethics, at the recently founded University of Chicago and invited Mead and Angell to follow him, the four men forming the basis of the so-called Chicago Group of Psychology. Their new style of psychology, later dubbed functional psychology, had a practical emphasis on action and application. In Dewey's article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, which appeared in Psychological Review in 1896, he reasons against the traditional stimulus-response understanding of the reflex arc in favor of a circular account in which what serves as stimulus and what as response depends on how one considers the situation. In defends the unitary nature of the sensory-motor circuit. While he does not deny the existence of stimulus, sensation, and response, he disagreed that they were separate, juxtaposed events happening like links in a chain. He developed the idea that there is a coordination by which the stimulation is enriched by the results of previous experiences. The response is modulated by sensorial experience. Dewey was elected president of the American Psychological Association in 1899. In 1984, the American Psychological Association announced that Lillian Moller Gilbreth had become the first psychologist to be commemorated on a United States postage stamp. However, psychologists Gary Briccato Jr. and John D. Hogan later made the case that this distinction actually belonged to John Dewey, who had been celebrated on an American stamp 17 years earlier. While some psychology historians consider Dewey more of a philosopher than a bona fide psychologist, the authors noted that Dewey was a founding member of the APA, served as the APA's 8th president in 1899, and was the author of an 1896 article on the reflex arc, which is now considered a basis of American functional psychology. Dewey also expressed interest in work in the psychology of visual perception performed by Dartmouth research professor Adelbert Ames, Jr. He had great trouble with listening, however, because it is known Dewey could not distinguish musical pitches, in other words was tone-deaf. Pragmatism, instrumentalism, consequentialism. Dewey sometimes referred to his philosophy as instrumentalism rather than pragmatism, and would have recognized the similarity of these two schools to the newer school named consequentialism. He defined with precise brevity the criterion of validity common to these three schools, which lack agreed-upon definitions, but in the proper interpretation of pragmatic, namely the function of consequences as necessary tests of the validity of propositions, provided these consequences are operationally instituted and are such as to resolve the specific problem evoking the operations. The text that follows is thoroughly pragmatic. His concern for precise definition led him to detailed analysis of careless word usage, reported in Knowing and the Known in 1949. Epistemology. The terminology problem in the fields of epistemology and logic is partially due, according to Dewey and Bentley, to inefficient and imprecise use of words and concepts that reflects three historic levels of organization and presentation. In the order of chronological appearance, these are: self-action. Pre-scientific concepts regarded humans, animals, and things as possessing powers of their own which initiated or caused their actions. Interaction, as described by Newton, where things, living and inorganic, are balanced against something in a system of interaction. For example, the third law of motion states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Transaction, where modern systems of descriptions and naming are employed to deal with multiple aspects and phases of action without any attribution to ultimate, final, or independent entities, essences, or realities. A series of characterizations of transactions indicate the wide range of considerations involved. Logic and method. Dewey sees paradox in contemporary logical theory. Proximate subject matter garners general agreement and advance, while the ultimate subject matter of logic generates unremitting controversy. In other words, he challenges confident logicians to answer the question of the truth of logical operators. Do they function merely as abstractions, or do they connect in some essential way with their objects, and therefore alter or bring them to light? Logical positivism also figured in Dewey's thought. About the movement he wrote that it eschews the use of propositions and terms, substituting sentences and words. He welcomes this changing of reference, in as far as it fixes attention upon the symbolic structure and content of propositions. However, he registers a small complaint against the use of sentence and words, in that without careful interpretation the act or process of transposition narrows unduly the scope of symbols and language. Since it is not customary to treat gestures and diagrams as words or sentences, in other words, sentences and words, considered in isolation, do not disclose intent which may be inferred or are judged only by means of context. Yet Dewey was not entirely opposed to modern logical trends. Concerning traditional logic, he states, Aristotelian logic, which still passes current nominally, is a logic based upon the idea that qualitative objects are existential in the fullest sense. To retain logical principles based on this conception, along with the acceptance of theories of existence and knowledge based on an opposite conception, is not, to say the least, conducive to clearness, a consideration that has a good deal to do with existing dualism between traditional and the newer relational logics. Louis Menand argues in The Metaphysical Club that Jane Addams had been critical of Dewey's emphasis on antagonism in the context of a discussion of the Pullman strike of 1894. In a later letter to his wife, Dewey confessed that Addams' argument was the most magnificent exhibition of intellectual and moral faith I ever saw. She converted me internally, but not really, I fear. When you think that Miss Addams does not think this is a philosophy, but believes it in all her senses and muscles, great God, I guess I'll have to give it all up and start over again. He went on to add, I can see that I have always been interpreting dialectic wrong, end up the unity as the reconciliation of opposites, instead of the opposites as the unity in its growth, and thus translated the physical tension into a moral thing. I don't know as I give the reality of this at all. It seems so natural and commonplace now, but I never had anything take hold of me so. In a letter to Addams herself, Dewey wrote, clearly influenced by his conversation with her, not only is actual antagonizing bad, but the assumption that there is or may be antagonism is bad. In fact, the real first antagonism always comes back to the assumption. Aesthetics. Art as experience is Dewey's major writing on aesthetics. It is, in accordance with his place in the pragmatist tradition that emphasizes community, a study of the individual art object as embedded in the experiences of a local culture. In the original illustrated edition, Dewey drew on the Modern Art and World Cultures collection assembled by Albert C. Barnes at the Barnes Foundation, whose own ideas on the application of art to one's way of life was influenced by Dewey's writing. Barnes was particularly influenced by democracy and education, and then attended Dewey's seminar on political philosophy at Columbia University in the fall semester of 1918.